Rhett is, when I first met Rhett, it was in Amsterdam. And like with some people I meet, we got deep into a philosophical discussion, I think from the second sentence. And it always struck me about how he could take a really interesting view of whatever we were discussing. And over the years, it's just blossomed. We've talked more and more. And he lives now in England. I think it's England, right? Not Scotland?
That's right.
Yeah. And he's really a philosopher. He teaches philosophy, but I believe he himself is a philosopher. So when I asked him about education, I thought he might be able to shed some light and give some perspective on what the future of education might be like. I don't believe he knows that much about virtual worlds, but he knows a lot about human nature and how people will adapt to environments. And I believe that he'll have something to add to it. So, Rhett, you're free to talk more or less. I mean, around the time period, there's the constraints of other people are more or less gone. We only have one person after you, and he's sitting here. So,
okay.
It's there's nobody that we have to connect to Skype or anything after that. So and I as far as I understand, you want to engage the audience a little bit more, the people who are here. You wanted to ask them questions and things. That's part of your presentation.
Well,
but can you also do us a favor and turn on your video?
We'll see how it goes.
Can you turn on your video? There we go.
I did.
Oh, it's just coming on now.
Yet?
You have to touch the little blue bar at the bottom, but you're starting to come up, so that people can see what a philosopher looks like. Well, he's black so far, and we really expect you to pop into view any minute now. There you are.
There I am.
Okay.
Okay.
You're not moving. It's not moving too fast. Okay, let's see if I can't put you in a window. Get you up. There's no Second Life component to this, so I think we hear you. Can you try moving around a little bit so I can see? Yeah.
It seems like there's a slight delay.
Okay, and just make sure that you're speaking loud enough into the microphone, and you're more or less. You can introduce yourself. I've given a kind of thing. You can correct me as much as you like. So please, Rhett, take it away.
Hey, so as Rob said, I am not a great user of the virtual worlds yet. My experience of Second Life consisted of showing up there naked, being unable to figure out how to get my clothes on, and people saying hello to me, at which point I ran away embarrassed, which showed me the power of Second Life, because why was I embarrassed? After all, I wasn't really there, and I wasn't really naked. But nonetheless, all of that aside, I am a philosophy instructor at the University of Colorado, although I live in very northern England. So I'm now teaching over the internet, although not using virtuality exactly. And in fact, not even using real presence. My classes are very untechnologically advanced for all that. But I've taught at CU for 18 years. And the thing that I'm interested in that I think is relevant to the topic of this conference is, I guess I used to call it intelligence increase. Maybe people call it cognitive enhancement or something now. But I'm really interested in education well, we need to do something about it. And the pre-warm-up, I watched the speaker sort of before the first speaker, and he said a couple of things which I thought were really relevant to what I want to say. First, he talked about the shelf life of university information. And as a university teacher, of course, I'm very interested in that. And he said, if you learned it the first year, it's irrelevant or no longer useful, obsolete. That's the word I'm looking for, by the fourth year. Now, of course, in my field, that's not true, because I teach people that have been dead for hundreds of years, and so they sort of continue to be either relevant or irrelevant as time goes by. But they're pretty much, Descartes has been dead an extra couple of years, but hasn't changed that much. Nonetheless, it does seem like most of what my students are learning isn't going to be that useful to them. And the second thing, which made me really worry even more about the future of education was he said that 90% of the information students get is not coming from their education. So my first question for your consideration, and you don't need to respond to this, is why do we believe that education is even relevant? Maybe the goal we should have is to get rid of education altogether. Figure out how they can get that last 10% that we're giving them in terms of information, and they can go their separate way. Now, I don't really think that's what we should be doing, but it does seem to me if what we're focused on is conveying information to our students as educators, that we're in fact in major trouble. Because the models of education that we've been using are based on the notion that there's not very much information and we have a monopoly on it. And in fact, it seems like the opposite is true. Information is so abundant that we, for the most part, can't keep track of even the things that are happening in the tiny areas of interest that we have. And if students are getting 90% of their information somewhere else, we certainly don't have any monopoly. So perhaps, if it weren't for pretty members of whichever gender you happen to be interested in, and beer, universities would just be completely out of luck. Well, I guess that's not really entirely true. But here's a question that we might want to consider in terms of our designing the future of education, which was the title of my talk. What counts as educational success? So I'd like to do a little experiment. Turn to the person next to you and answer that question from your point of view. I'll give you like 30 seconds or so, just to tell them what you think educational success is. And then take turns. You each get about 30 seconds. Those of you whose heads aren't turning, I can tell you're not talking.
Yeah. Educational success.
What is educational success? And how would you know that it was achieved?
That's a good question. I think it comes when I feel like I've learned something.
It's sharing some of your own knowledge with someone else.
Yeah,
Education is
I would say
transferring your
sure.
knowledge, not just things popping out of the air.
Yeah, you have an idea? Okay.
All right.
Well, we're
So,
getting some responses. What do you think, Rudolph?
I think learning a language.
If you want, grab a microphone and Joe, could you maybe pass a microphone? Yes, right. It's, thanks, Rudy. Cheers.
Hello, are you there? Learning a language, I think it gives such satisfaction.
so learning it to the level of a 5-year-old, learning it to the level of Shakespeare.
No, whenever you feel comfortable with it, it's not
Right.
important. You know, it's just individually how you experience that. Yeah.
Okay. So learning a language, that's good. Of course, I would need something to talk about that language. Right.
Sergio, beside me, said that when you can share it, I actually think, from my own perspective, and I've thought this for a long time, that you don't really know anything unless you can explain it to someone else. And I've also thought that in the process of explaining it to somebody else, that's actually when you learn it. It's almost at that moment that it sort of goes bing in your head and you go, oh, right, now I really get it. I started talking before I knew, and then by the end of the conversation, it actually makes sense. That's not, I mean, wholly true all the time, but it certainly has happened a number of times to me. You start out on a pathway, and you think you know what you're talking about, and then all of a sudden something crystallizes in the process of describing it. That's what I think learning is. Maybe explaining it to yourself with other people listening.
So let me frame this just slightly differently. What's educational success in terms of institutions? How do they know when they're succeeding in educating their students?
When the students are explaining it back to everybody else, by my criteria, I guess. If the students can really explain it and come up with this process, that's my own opinion. But does anyone else have another opinion? Take the microphone.
I guess in the real world, the schools are accounted for how many students get their grades or whatever, are
Right.
successful students.
Yes, students who get good grades are successful students. Students who get bad grades are unsuccessful students. That's right. We might wonder, although we won't address it, what grades are based on. But I spent a number of years in the classroom, and I asked my students quite frequently what they thought about their education and what they thought success was. And this is what they told me. Well, about 80% of them told me this. Success is getting a job. And I thought, well, okay, that seems at least vaguely connected to what I'm doing, although it does seem like almost all of what is being taught at the university has nothing to do with the jobs people will be doing once they're out of the university. But okay, getting a job. And I thought, well, okay, let me ask you another question, I say to my students. Why do students cheat? And this is a pretty relevant question because it turns out that 70% of high school students report that they cheat at some point in time or another in their process. And I said, well, why do students cheat? And they said, well, it's because it's a shortcut to getting the goal, which you've already said. The goal is getting good grades, right? So if you could get the good grade without knowing anything more than you knew before you took the class, wouldn't you prefer to take less time and less effort and get a better grade? And most of them agreed with this because they have what I call the circus dog theory of education, which is education is a series of hoops that you jump through, and at the end you get a biscuit. But the problem with that is circus dogs don't change when they jump through hoops. They're the same dog they were before they jumped through. And for all of myself and my fellow educators, and you all, if you're educators, work at trying to change the students, what they told me was basically stuff goes in one ear, goes out the other, and they forget it 5 minutes after the test because it's irrelevant. They're just being processed through something so that they can get a rubber stamp on a diploma at the end, so that they can get a job, which is a ticket to a better world. Now, whose fault is that they believe this? Well, it can't really be their fault. They must have learned it somewhere. After all, we're all talking about learning. They learned it from us. Because it isn't just the content of what we're teaching that they learn, it's what we believe about their future and about what we're doing that matters, right? So the system of education currently in place treats the students as passive receptacles, as reproducers of already known knowledge, which maybe they'll be taught how to treat critically and analytically, but beyond that, not so much. Okay, so what needs to change for education to change? Well, our vision of what students are, right? Students in the future, because we need a vision of the future, will be designers and synthesis. They'll be putting things together, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples of how I've attempted to do this in the classroom. I taught my students mind mapping, which is probably a commonplace technique for people like yourselves, where you do visual representations on a piece of paper or a computer program of information in some nonlinear way. And it's a really great way of remembering things. It's a very pallid version of, say, Rob's work on DNA or something where you're really visualizing the information. And so I wanted my students to be able to see how things connected. So I taught this to a class, and then after they learned it, I asked them to use it in other classes. I asked one of my very best students, a hard-working future doctor, how this was going in her other classes, and this is what she said. Well, I stopped using it in my other classes because while it helped me understand the information better, I didn't really want to understand it better. I knew I was just memorizing it and was going to forget it in 15 minutes anyway, so why bother? I thought, well, that's pretty interesting. Secondly, I used a sort of non-linear final system where they had to connect concepts which they hadn't previously put together by sort of randomly associating things. And most of my students claimed this was the best final they had ever had. Why? Because they had never been asked to think in school before. So I guess the core of what I'm trying to communicate today is the idea that we as educators need to change how we think about our students and the goal of education. Well, how is this connected to virtual worlds? Well, it seems to me, of course, as someone who is, as I said earlier, only been in virtual worlds very briefly, that virtual worlds are a great opportunity to experiment. Rob and I have had several conversations about the importance of recognizing that virtual worlds are not merely reproductions of the actual world or the non-virtual world. Well, that's great. Students themselves need to learn that they can create things rather than be handed things on a plate. So the process of how students are taught is at least as important, if not more important, than the content, since the content's mostly going to change anyway. So if we can ourselves as teachers be designers and facilitators of design, then our students can become creators themselves, and perhaps, to kind of sneak in a little plug for philosophy, we'll end up with wisdom as the goal rather than knowledge. So I'll call that the end for the moment. If there are any
Wonderful.
questions or comments.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Rhett. Questions? Anybody? Comments? Yeah, can you grab a mic?
Right now, people are being educated for a job. On average, society expects that people are going to be productive members of society in a few years. But it is arguable and plausible that in 25 years, or at least one generation, most people that now have a job won't have a job anymore. Automatization is going to destroy most jobs very soon and very rapidly. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I'll take a slight digression in an attempt to answer it. In my philosophy classes, I present my students with this choice. I say, in the future, no one will have a job. Not just most people, but no one. Robots, artificial intelligences will do everything that involves money. Would you like to live in this world? 80% of my students don't want to. And I'm like, what's the problem? Well, first they say, well, what about, how will people eat and so forth? And I say, well, okay, we'll take the utopian version of this where money and food is not concentrated in the hands of the owners of the machine, but everybody's sort of taken care of. Okay. They still don't want to live in this world. Why not? Because they believe that people won't do anything, including them. I say, so what do you mean? Well, people are only motivated by money. If there's no money, no one will do anything. I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. Don't you have hobbies? And eventually I sort of work them around to seeing that, in fact, there are other sorts of motivations. So part of what I would change in order to accommodate the thing that you're asking me about is removing what I call the gold star letter grade currency model of motivation, right? We teach our students to be motivated by external rewards because it's easier to control them that way, right? I write on the board, we use an A, B, C, D, F system in the United States, F being the worst. And I write on the board, you've gotten a paperback for me. There's this letter at the bottom, A. How do you feel? They feel good. Then I put an F at the bottom. Now how do you feel? I feel bad. Then I put an R at the bottom, and they don't know how to feel. But that shows them that they've been conditioned. And I'm like, thank God that you've had 12 or 13 years of education so that I can control your emotional states by writing a letter on a piece of paper. I mean, that's a lot less work for me than trying to get you interested in something creative, right? So I would say that one of the things that you would need to do to accommodate the world without work is to teach people by offering them spaces to explore their own internal motivations so that when they grow up, they're not slaves. I mean, not having work is only a problem for slaves, right? As long as you're eating and you got a place to live and all those things. The other 20% are like, oh my God, I'm free. I can read all the books I want. I can write all the poetry I want. I can play all the music I want. I can hang out with my friends as much as I want. So 80% of my students, who turn out to be exactly the same 80% who think the purpose of school is to get a job, have been trained to be slaves. And the other 20%, who also turn out to be the 20% that are in school because they want to learn something, right, are excited by this prospect. Right now, there are obviously going to be economic issues about how you're going to distribute the results of the labor of all the nanotechnology and robots and so forth. But we'll leave that to another question, to another state of affairs. Did I answer your question?
Yep.
Thank you.
I think I was pretty happy. Is there anybody else? Another
Yep.
comment, a question? Go ahead.
Okay,
PJ.
I had another question in mind, but I'll forget that. Just listening to you now, when I read books like Snow Crash by Stevenson or Neuromancer by Gibson or Other Land by Ted Williams, which includes some form of metaverse and look into the future, what strikes me is that every vision of the future is a little dystopian. And you're talking about the utopian approach. How does it get that when so many people start thinking about technology in the future, that we end up with a dystopian view of the future?
Right. Well, I think there are a couple reasons for that. One is, of course, we are still outgrowing our belief in original sin. So we have lived in a culture that is sort of bathed in guilt and the belief that human beings just aren't good enough. And so, of course, our creations just won't be good enough. Secondly, I think there's, well, I don't know. I'll say something flip. Too bad Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. But the third thing is something like this. Leaders have learned that in the short term, the best way to motivate the herd to run in a direction is to scare the crap out of them. So we have a lot of people from the right, from the left, from the center, wherever, who would like to motivate us in some direction. With an inconvenient truth, with too many people from somewhere else, with whatever, because fear works. It creates group unity, it creates motivation. And then eventually what you get is, of course, a culture where everybody's afraid at some level or another. I myself remember growing up with the idea that we were all going to run into some room in the basement of my high school when the Russians nuked us. Since then, we've got the visions of ecological collapse and so forth. And I think it's very easy to imagine how things can go wrong. And I guess so, yeah, it's very easy to imagine how things could go wrong. And we have a lot of support for that. People get a lot of political power out of it. And I don't know, I think it's kind of fun reading scary things, just sort of to talk about, Gibson and those in that crowd. The flip side is utopia requires some belief that we human beings actually have everything we need to succeed, and sort of being willing to act on that, maybe even contrary to some of the evidence. So I guess that's what I would say about that. Was that did I at least sort of vaguely address your question?
Yes, it did. It raised
Thanks.
another question, though.
Okay.
Go for it.
when you think about this utopian, and fear is easier is an easier tool to stimulate the masses. When we look at the future, it's usually individually, and like your students wanting to learn, they were the ones looking forward to the future. But then again, we have this problem of emergent behavior, that we conform to the crowd in what we do, and end up doing things we don't really want to do ourselves. How do you address that?
Sure. Okay, I think that's worth addressing. No one decided that we would have automobiles. And while there are certain problems with the proliferation of automobiles, one of the things we don't have to deal with is Amsterdam or New York City being knee-deep in horse shit. So we at least solved that problem. So it seems like one of the things that we often overlook is that humans have two really great characteristics. One, we're incredibly good at making mistakes. Most animal species are actually really bad at making mistakes, right? I mean, when was the last time, ants as sort of a species really made a serious error? 100 million years ago, 50 million years ago, whenever ants kind of got their system organized, they're sort of moving along, right? So human beings, if mistakes are an opportunity for learning, we're doing really well. We've made lots. The second thing that we're really good at is learning from those mistakes. So I think it's good that we're making, in my model of the world, it's good that we're making these mistakes. But to try to address more specifically your question about sort of collective action, it seems like, to drag this back in the direction of education, part of the reason that this is true is most people have been educated to believe that their effect on collective action is going to be either very small or non-existent. So, of course, they're going to imagine the future in terms of their individual choices and the things they're capable of doing, because they don't fundamentally believe that they're able to design the future in any real sense. I mean, my students believe that they're consumers. Well, what could be more passive than being a consumer? It's like being a baby. You open your mouth and things come in. Well, you can decide which direction to turn your head, so you can decide which food is going in, but that's about all you can manage. So it seems to me part of the solution to the problem is training people to believe that they can have an effect, and also to think about what their effect might actually be. And secondly, to stop offering visions of the future that are based on convincing people that they need to change their morality, and offer them futures that are like the car. People weren't convinced that the car was morally better than the horse. It was just better. Got you places faster, so forth and so on. So if we who are interested in different futures want to affect the masses of people, give them better choices, which means designing better choices for them. So I'll stop there.
And
Was that
Yes,
was
thanks.
that okay?
is there anybody else? Oh, one more. Have we got somebody from the internet or? Oh, Z. Oh, okay.
She has a question. I'll say it exactly as it's written down. Don't we all have to accept that virtual realities are not really virtual, almost real, but a very real part of reality, therefore part of real life? What would be a better word for the metaverse and media art of reality, next to the physical reality? Meet space or metaverse?
Did you understand that?
I didn't.
Okay. I'm
Bit
not
too
sure
much
I understood it
minutes.
either. Is it on the?
It's in your chat log. Yeah,
Huh?
it's in the chat log there.
It's in the chat.
Which one?
It's probably in the general.
In the local chat.
Okay. Let me see if I can interpret it. One sec, Rhett.
Sure.
Can you turn it a little bit so I can see? Don't. What's that? Oh,
It's right there.
Can you see it on the
It's right. It's on the screen.
on the web? But he can't see the web. I think you're not looking at the stream.
No,
of it,
I'm
are
just,
you?
I can just see kind of a blurry version of the audience.
Okay, no, it says, don't we all have to accept that virtual realities are not really virtual, but they're almost real, but a really very real part of reality. Therefore, a part of real life. What would be a better word for the metaverse and media art of reality? What would be a better word for it? Next to the physical reality, meet space or metaverse? But I don't think that's it. I don't think that was intended for Rhett, or do you think it was?
It was my question
Okay.
to Rhett. So.
Meet space or meta?
Metaverse.
Meet space or metaverse? I think it was a somewhat rhetorical question. I don't think that there's just an opinion. What word do you prefer? Meet space or metaverse? Okay. Yeah, I know it's meat as in the flesh, as opposed to and metaverse. But I think it's maybe a question that doesn't have an answer, except choose A or B. Blue pill or red pill? Red.
I'll take the red pill.
Okay, good. Is there anybody else? No? I'd just like to thank you very much. It was very entertaining, a great conversation as always. And
Okay.
thanks again. Much appreciated.
Thank you.